The information featured in this program is general in nature and therefore should not be relied upon. Guests appearing on the program may have commercial arrangements with some of the companies mentioned. Before making any investment, insurance or financial planning decisions, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether or not your decision is appropriate for you. Property Investing Matters is brought to you by Destiny, empowering investors to achieve success through property investment for more than 24 years.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Property Investing Matters. Great to have you on board for another week of property education. Now, thanks to everyone who have sent in their questions for the show tonight. If we don't get to your question tonight, then we will carry it over for a future show, probably the one after next week, and you will still get the book prize that week. But if we do answer your question tonight, you're going to be receiving the book of mine, which is called How to Achieve Property Success. This is valued at $40 in all good bookshops. So it is a genuine prize, and it is the prize for all of the questions that we answer tonight. Now to my guest, strata consultant Michael Teys. Michael has been a strata lawyer specialising in strata issues, and today he's a strata academic researcher and also an educator working for UNSW in Sydney and Deakin University in Melbourne. Tonight we are looking at the state of the unit market and a few COVID-related issues. So let's get started and welcome Michael to the show. Michael, how are you going?
Good, Margaret. I'm sorry about my long COVID hair, but apart from that, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Well, we were just talking about that off air, and I think we all have COVID hair. I'm sure all of the viewers have COVID hair as well. And I just can't wait to get out there to the hairdresser again, which I'm sure everybody would love to. But for today, what I really want to talk about is the unit market, because we don't generally specify the unit market in most of the shows. We do talk about the property market and what it's doing. And when we're looking at figures all around Australia for the property market, you tend to find that it's throwing all property in together, and it doesn't differentiate between units and houses. And often that can skew the figures a fair amount. So what I really want to know at the moment, we know that we've come through quite a few years of oversupply of units in a number of our markets. Are there still markets with an oversupply at the moment? And if there are, which ones are they?
Yeah. Thanks, Margaret. Yes, there certainly are oversupplied areas. But before I get to that, I want to say something about the press treatment of this topic as well. Because, we know in the times in which we live particularly, the press love to give a story a negative headline, even if the underlying story is a positive one. And we saw that recently with the ABC report on the core logic numbers to the end of March. The headline is unit prices fall in many city suburbs amid a house-led real estate boom. And that, of course, is a true statement. But what the headline doesn't say is that units have in fact gone up in value in every capital city in Australia, from Sydney at a meagre 0.2%, but right up to 9.8% in Darwin, 11.2% in Hobart, healthy figures in Perth of 4, Adelaide 5, Brisbane up 1.9, Canberra up 5.8%. So the truth of the matter is that unit prices have gone up across the board. What hasn't happened, of course, is that they haven't gone up as much as houses. But I think it's time that we started to look at the market separately, because not everyone wants to buy a house. And not everyone can afford to buy a house, either to live in or as an investment property. They're very different things. So we need to start looking at them differently. If you then drill down into the figures, some interesting things come out. In Sydney, for example, the underperforming units, where there have been significant falls, are in the middle ring suburbs of St Leonard's, Chatswood, Croydon, Lane Cove. Now, in those places, we've seen a lot of development over the last few years, and it's pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? It's pretty unoriginal. They're all much of a muchness. There's no real point of difference to the units, they're a little bit ordinary, and there's a lot of them. So those areas have taken a hit. In Melbourne, the worst performing places are Moonee Ponds, Ascot Vale and Kew. Now again, that's interesting because it's not Docklands or St Kilda or Port Melbourne that we'd expect.
South Bank, which I would have expected, just
Yeah,
having seen, the cranes in the sky over the last couple of years in those really inner city
that's right.
suburbs there.
Now
I would have expected them to be worse.
that might be because they've already taken their hit and are not selling, so the sales aren't being reported in any great number. But nevertheless, interesting again that's gone to the middle ring where again developments haven't got a standout point of view. I just want to take a quick look at a couple of other cities. In Brisbane, however, we go back to the trend of the inner city apartments being the poor performers. South Brisbane down 9% and Brisbane City down 7.8%. So that's sort of where Melbourne and Sydney were 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years ago anyway. And they're very poor numbers. Canberra is holding its own, and Adelaide in the city is down 4.8, but the suburbs are doing well. So I think we see there some distortion in the way things are being viewed and reported. Anecdotally, units that are older and from smaller blocks are doing very well. They're selling very quickly in Brisbane, for example. We're looking in around Nunda and Chermside and those suburbs, and good older units. When I say older, I mean 70s, 80s, 90s, are selling within days in the Brisbane market.
So, Michael, we've been talking for years about the oncoming, first of all, oversupply in cities like Sydney, to a lesser degree, Melbourne to a great degree, Brisbane along the river there, and even Adelaide, where urban living isn't really a thing and units were being built. And then we talked about it when it arrived, that we had a bigger oversupply. What's the situation now in those major areas? Has the oversupply worked its way out yet? Is it working its way out yet? Or are we still in oversupply?
I think we're still in oversupply in those big cities, in Sydney and Melbourne, in parts of those cities. And I think probably, as I said, they've either taken their hit on these numbers or they're just not moving. So the evidence is not being tracked in any proper way. If you look at the vacancy rate, it's around 3 at the moment. So that's just just in the middle of the pendulum. So it would certainly be correcting itself. The question is, has it corrected itself yet? Unit markets, of course, react more slowly than the housing market because it takes 3 years to build a decent unit block. So, or it can take up to 3 years. So I think it is correcting itself. It probably hasn't finished the correction yet, but it's certainly on the way. The point for investors, I think, Margaret, and it's the same as in the housing market, is to be looking for that investment that has a point of difference. That really, is it a balcony? Is it a location? Is it a style? The Art Deco blocks, for example, in Sydney. What is it about the particular unit that is making it different to the standard cookie cutter, high rise, 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom? For example, with working from home becoming a thing, units that have a work station, a workplace, are going to be sought after. So it's looking for that distinguishing feature, and not just accepting the press and the sweeping generalizations that of necessity the press make in order to speak about the various trends. But we need to dig a little bit deeper. And when you do dig deeper, the unit market is not all bad news.
So are there any parts of Australia where there is a demand for units that isn't being met right now?
I think you'll find that in Darwin and in Hobart, but they're small towns, small cities, of course. But yes, I think that's the case there.
I hope so. I've got a unit in Darwin that I'd like to grow in value. It's not back to where it was when I bought it. It's still double what I paid for it, but it's not anywhere near what it was.
No, there really is. We own a unit in Sydney, in a city, and it's a good unit in an older block. It's a 20-year-old block with a city skyline view and a good balcony, and it's doing very well, exceedingly well.
Yeah.
You know, there is more to it than doom and gloom. There is certainly doom and gloom in some of the cookie cutter buildings, and it's not just oversupply. There's also quality issues, which we'll talk about, no doubt, as the show goes on.
Well, as it turns out, we're about to talk about that right now. And, you know, to switch up the topics a little bit, I believe that there are new design and construction laws in New South Wales. Can you tell us a little bit more about exactly what they are and how are they going to impact on the unit market?
Yeah, they're sweeping changes in the way in which buildings are built now in New South Wales from the 1st of July. So it's very, very new. But we have a building commissioner who's been given very wide powers to go onto building sites and stop work, to refuse occupation certificates to be issued until he and his team are satisfied that they've been built correctly. Now, this is a very new power, but the commissioner is quite a good operator, if I can use that expression, and he's taken to some of the biggest and notorious developers first and issued stop orders on some very big buildings. So far, there have been 12 developments that have been stopped in their tracks, nearing completion, until such time as they can be satisfied that provisions have been made for better workmanship in the building. Now, that's not a lot when you consider that something like 1,700 buildings are registered a year in Sydney. But nevertheless, it has made a statement and it has sent shockwaves through the development community that those that are persistent breaches of standards and quality will be held to account, and they will be held to account at a time when it hurts them most, when their peak debt is drawn down and they haven't yet got the cash in from the buyers. So it is a very significant, and it's almost a micromanagement of some developments. The other aspect of the new laws, which is very interesting, is that from now on, you have to register your detailed building plans as the building is built. And if there's a variation, then the variation needs to be registered with the Commissioner's office within 2 days of that change being made. Now, that's going to do two things. Firstly, it's going to allow the Commissioner's team to make desktop assessments of what's going on in the field and respond very quickly. And secondly, where buildings have been constructed and then there are problems, it's going to give some real detailed papers that are useful in seeking rectification orders. So that's again a very drastic step that's been taken, but in circumstances where it was well overdue and well required. So there's really a lot. I'm very hopeful that this is going to make a significant change to the quality of what is coming down the line. It's not doing anything, of course, for those that have built over the last 20 years when supervisionary standards have been lax, but it is certainly, I think, likely to restore confidence to the market and improve the quality of the sector as we move on. Will that be copied by other states and territories? Well, you'd have to be a very brave person at the moment to suggest that there'd be any harmony at all between our states and territories. But it's certainly a very, very interesting approach. It's quite novel, it's quite unique, and I think it's going to achieve great results for New South Wales.
Certainly, if similar changes aren't adopted into the other states, they're going to have some kind of change of their own, because I understand that it isn't just New South Wales that has all of these issues with buildings. There certainly are plenty of them in Melbourne, and no doubt plenty of them in Brisbane as well.
Yes,
and the other states too.
Well, the worst, Margaret, is Canberra.
Right.
The unit market in Canberra has been subjected to some horrible work, and there are some very, very serious problems there, and a very poor response, if I might say, by the regulators in Canberra.
All right, well, look, let's now go to COVID news and units. Obviously, units have been in the news with respect to if a COVID case occurs in an apartment block, the nature of the living in an apartment block and the sharing of common property. dictates that that entire apartment block goes into lockdown in a way that residents in a street in their own homes wouldn't have to, even if those houses are built very, very close to each other. What should an apartment block be doing right now in all areas to protect themselves from both a health point of view, but also from a financial one?
Yeah, certainly there's very clear guidelines now about what apartment buildings should be doing, including wearing masks when you're on common property, closing pools and gymnasiums and saunas. There's been some controversy about that, and we've been coming through winter, so it's been less of an issue, but that's certainly the recommended practice. Installing sanitizers in the foyer near the lifts so that people can clean their hands before they touch lift buttons and the like. Limiting the number of people in lifts, all of those things that you would expect are now expected to be done in residential buildings, even though it is private property and not commercial or government property. I think
I would expect that all of these kinds of compliance issues are going to add to the financial bottom line to apartment blocks.
Yes.
And does that mean that unit owners are likely to see their levies increased as a result of that?
I think so. And what is also happening is people are choosing then to spend less on other things which might require work. There's a recent case in Queensland in the Mondrian apartments in Cairns where the QCAT, that is the Disputes Tribunal, has ordered a building to go ahead with its $55,000 painting job, where they voted to defer that because of financial hardship on some of the owners due to COVID. So that's an interesting case where we have a directly on-point decision, and I think a correct decision, where the Commissioner has said, look, COVID is unfortunate and financial hardship is regrettable, but you have a building here and you have a strict liability duty under the law to repair and maintain that property when it needs to be repaired and maintained. The painting is long overdue, and the asset is at risk if it is not looked after properly. So they've enforced the strict liability to repair and maintain common property, which exists in every jurisdiction in Australia. Every state and territory has that obligation. So that's an interesting decision, and puts to rest any suggestion that an owners' corporation or a committee can act compassionately when it comes to this. So the question arises: how do you juggle? And it looks like this is with us for some time. How do you juggle your responsibilities as co-owners of property? And of course, in the unit market, you have different obligations than you do if you own a home. If you own a home, you can repair it when you like. If you own a unit, you have to repair it immediately it needs repair. And so owners corporations are going to have to budget very carefully. One of the things that I think is inevitable is that strata loans will be used more frequently by owners corporations, where some of the owners fall into arrears, even in the smaller buildings. It's in fact a bigger problem in the smaller buildings than it is in the large buildings, because if you're in a building of 6 and 2 people can't pay their levies, you've got a real problem. If you're in a building of 300 and 10 people can't pay, it's less of an impact. There's more places to hide. So I think smaller buildings will turn to strata lenders and say, look, we need to borrow money. It's unsecured finance because an owners corporation can't give a mortgage. So it's expensive money. That is running at about 7.5%, 8% at the moment. But some people will have to do that if they can't balance their books.
Michael, does the requirements around units to have your sanitizer and your cleaning procedures and all of those things, do they apply to every state and to every size building, or are they specific from state to state?
They're specific from state to state. I haven't checked them all. I've looked at the New South Wales ones. I'd be surprised if they weren't following one another, because it's all pretty common sense stuff in terms of the regulation. Those buildings without lifts, without pools, without extensive common property are going to be less affected of course, than those that have got the higher levies in the first place because of bigger infrastructure.
Okay, well, look, I've got one last thing which doesn't relate to anything that we've talked about so far, except that it's about units, but it's something that I've often thought about and am aware of, but know, in fact, that many people who are a member of a body corporate or an owner's corporation probably doesn't realise this, but I find that a lot of owners' corporations don't understand or even think about directors and officers' insurance. Can
Yes.
you explain what that is and why it is so important?
And it's particularly important in the times in which we live, Margaret, because for the first time in my 30 years of working in the unit market, people are dying in buildings. There's cladding fires around the world. The circumstances of that building in Miami, I think, are going to have significant impacts for the unit market everywhere in the world. The news out of Miami, of course, is a building collapsed. Something, I'm not sure of the exact figure, it's something like 69 or 70 people died. And we're still, strata academics around the world are just starting to come to grips with what happened in that building, and there will be a number of inquiries to be conducted. But what we do know so far is that there was a report issued by an engineer suggesting that the building was in urgent need of repair. The question is whether the engineer had gone far enough to say that the building should be evacuated. But there was also a dispute between the committee about doing the work, and some of the committee resigned as a result of a decision not to do the work. And now we're in a situation where the building's fallen to the ground and people have died. Now, I can tell you from my own experience as a former practicing lawyer in this area that I've worked on many, many cases in Australia where engineers' reports have issued warnings in the harshest of terms without just stopping short of saying the building should be evacuated. And of course, no one wants to say those words because it's so catastrophic for the owners, but so too is the collapse of a neglected building. And what's happened in Miami could easily happen anywhere in the world, because we have buildings that are now, if your building was built in the 70s, it's well and truly past its middle age, and if it hasn't been well looked after, there could be serious issues there, particularly buildings by the coast where you have issues about rust and concrete cancer. So the Miami case, as tragic and sad as it is, will provide lessons for us, and they are lessons that will need to be taken. Now, that brings us, of course, to the issue of personal liability for being on a committee. Apart from the horror of having to live with the fact that someone died because of a decision that you made or you didn't make, there is the financial implications of that. And I find all the time that people sort of try to skimp on insurance because it is relatively expensive, and they'll say no to directors and officers' insurance liability, which is absolute insanity, because you do have a liability, you are personally liable, and you need to take that insurance. It's not very expensive compared to the other parts of your insurance. It's almost incidental. There is a report being released next month about the insurance industry and its application to strata. So watch this space about that and what it finds. But certainly I'm concerned that not everybody that is sitting on a committee is taking it seriously enough to say, look, I want personal protection. And if I'm going to devote my Sunday afternoon to working on this building for no money, the very least you can do is insure and pay a small premium to make sure that I'm covered for any liability. I think it's an absolute no-brainer, and people need to insist that they have that insurance.
Absolutely. Certainly raises an awful amount of questions, Michael, and I know that a lot of people will have questions as a result of hearing all of that from you. And if they do have questions, they can definitely send it along to us. And if we don't get to answer it on this show, we definitely will be able to answer it on a future show. And if it's a strata question, I'll send it off to Michael or save it for when Michael is next on the show. And once we do answer it, don't forget you get the book of the week. This week, it is How to Achieve Property Success. be in the running, just ask your question. And you can do that by emailing it to me on pam@mypropertytv.com.au or by posting it to a comment on any of my Facebook posts, or you can send me a DM even, or on the My Property TV Facebook page. If you don't have a question though, you can still get that book by simply going to the shop on my website, destiny.com.au, or even to any good bookshop, and you should be able to find some of my books in those bookshops. Much still to come on Property Investing Matters. We are going to be taking just a short break to show you some messages, and then we will definitely be right back here for more on our strata discussion and to answer your questions. We'll see you back here soon. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us for the show. And you can help us to keep the show running by telling every single person that you know to tune in each week when we air. Even during lockdown, we're still producing as often as we possibly can. And joining me for this episode is strata consultant Michael Teys, and we're answering all of your questions and also talking about all things strata. Let's get to those questions now, Michael. We've got a couple of very interesting ones tonight. And the first one comes from Celia. And Celia asks, "Hi, Michael. We are a small block with limited funds in our sinking fund. We have an issue with one unit. There has been water ingress, and the floors, which are timber, need to be redone now that the water ingress is fixed. Due to the nature of the floor and its specific and unique design, the entire floor needs replacing as the damaged areas cannot be fixed to match. The issue is that the owner is 6 months behind in levies. What are our legal obligations to have this rectification work done?" Very interesting question, Michael.
Yes, and not an uncommon situation, Margaret. And sometimes people feel that when their unit is not being repaired, they're entitled to not pay their levies. And that's, of course, not the case. Two wrongs don't make a right. So what we have here, Celia, is a situation where the repairs must be done. If you were watching earlier in the show, I said that each state and territory in Australia has a law that says that a unit must be repaired when it falls into disrepair, and that's an immediate obligation, not when you can afford it, not when everyone's paid their levies, not when it's reasonable, but it must be done immediately. So the owner's corporation or body corporate, depending upon where you are, needs to get on with that work and do it in the way in which you've described. And it is true that if they can't match the floors, then the whole of the floor must be replaced to return it to the state that it was in before the damage. That said, the unit owner needs to be told as well that they can't just not pay their share of the expenses because they're not happy or because it doesn't suit them, and that obligation needs to be enforced, but they need to be mutually enforced. You can't hold off doing the repairs until they pay, and they can't hold you to ransom either. So somebody needs to have a good talk to the unit owner and say, listen, you've got to pay your share, but you do the right thing. We're going to do the right thing as our obligation, and we'll get this fixed. Water damage is a common issue, and it's an important issue, and we're seeing more and more evidence about mould and the impact of mould on people's health. So again, it's important that it be done correctly. It sounds like you are going about it in the correct way. You just need to get everybody on board to perform their part of the bargain.
Absolutely. Let's go to our next question, and this one comes from Ruby, and Ruby says, we have two very strong members of our owners corporation who tend to make decisions based on what is best for them. By doing so, they often gain a majority. This has resulted in seemingly a lot of funds being spent on their units. How can we best make sure that decisions are made for the good of everyone, and how do we change the balance of power here?
Well, this, of course, Margaret, is a situation that arises a lot, of course, because powerful people tend to find themselves on committees, or dominant people. First thing I'd say to Ruby in this particular question is to make sure that her facts are correct. Sometimes when we have dominant bullies on committees, their behaviour irritates us so much that we assume that what they're doing is wrong. It might be that this money has been spent appropriately. It might just be that their units needed money spent on them, and even though they've gone about it in an unpleasant and obnoxious way, that it might be correct. So the first thing I would say to Ruby is, don't talk in generalisations. Let's have a look at the facts. How much of the levies have been spent on which unit and why? And put that down on a piece of paper. All of that is discernible from the records of the body corporate, which of course Ruby's entitled to see. If then there has been an expenditure on unnecessary things, or things that favour one over the other unfairly, then that's very serious. And of course, I think what should happen there is Ruby should ask to be on the committee, and it's only by getting on the committee and forcing these issues that bullies and people that tend to dominate will start to change their ways. It's going to take some effort and some courage on Ruby's part, but that's what has to happen. If that then doesn't work, then you've got to go off to the tribunal for orders, because if that is correct, if it can be demonstrated that they're spending money improperly, that's very serious. And a tribunal won't hesitate to make an order if it can be proved. But I stress that in strata disputes, I've seen many times disputes go nowhere because of sweeping generalisations and assumptions. You have to do the work and see whether or not what you feel has happened is in fact what has happened.
Yeah, Michael, I feel like I would almost, I can identify with this from the other side of things, where in my block of unit, I could have been that that bully who was getting all the work done. For example, my balcony was leaking through to the bifold doors of the person under me, and as a result of that, my balcony was completely retiled. And then the person below, their balcony wasn't done, but there was nothing wrong with the balcony except that it was older looking and it wasn't modern. But you know, it was all tested for its waterworthiness, and there was no leaking. And then we found some problems when we were doing renovations here, that even though we were doing the renovations, the problems that we found were, you know, substrata, and they were the sorts of things that were common property really. And then all of those things got fixed, and for a while there it just seemed like all the money out of the sinking fund was being spent on my unit. And I can kind of understand how the others would have thought, well, hang on a minute, nothing is being spent on our unit, but nothing was being identified in any other unit as being a problem.
Exactly. And you know, that is the cost of collective living. And so it is about getting to the facts. I think people, if people have a dominant position on a committee or a leadership role on a committee, and it is their unit that is the subject of repairs and work, they need to be very sensitive about the perceptions. And, you know, there are ways of handling that. You might step down, you might say, look, I'm not going to vote, I'd rather not. You know, there are ways of which you can indicate that, you know, and I'm sure in your case, all was well in the end. But it is a question of getting to the facts. And I think if more people focused on where actually is this piece of work, what is it, who owns it, what's got to be done, why has it got to be done, if there was more than that, rather than just, oh, you know, all the money's going to his or her place, I think we'd have less disputes. But unfortunately, to find out the facts takes a bit of work. And but you've got to be prepared to do the work. I mean, effectively, if you are making this allegation about someone, you're alleging they're stealing trust funds. That's a very serious allegation. And before you make that allegation, I think it's worthy to really to test whether or not what you're thinking is correct.
Now, our last question tonight is actually about commercial property or a commercial unit, and I find it quite an interesting one. And it's from Ralph. Ralph says, "Hi there. When we bought our commercial unit, we were allocated in the purchase contract 6 parking spaces, though they were not on title. Once all the units were all sold, a body corporate decision was made to have no allocated spaces. This was done, I believe, because smaller units, which were only allocated 1 space each, wanted access to more. Now, one of those units runs education programs and their students take up most of the parking. We can't even get 1 parking space for ourselves, let alone any for our clients, unless we arrive very early. As the area is highly congested, it is affecting our ability to do business as people cannot park anywhere near us. What is the situation, and do we have any rights to those 6 allocated spaces?"
This is a very sad tale. Commercial strata, of course, only ever fights about parking, pavements, and signage, and in that respect, it's quite different to residential. But I would be inclined to approach this problem, Ralph, by going back and really checking what happened when the body corporate was set up. If you were given 6 parking spaces in your contract, even as a bylaw, a common property bylaw, for your exclusive use, it would be very unusual if your solicitor has enabled you to settle without you having the proper bylaw to give you that. Now, parking, of course, doesn't have to be on title. Parking can be on common property, but then you can be given exclusive use of those car spaces by a bylaw. So it would be very unusual and very negligent of a solicitor to miss, or a conveyancer to miss that. So go back and check that, because if they were given to you properly by bylaws set up by the developer before the body corporate took over, then they can't be taken away without your signed written consent. And you don't have to act reasonably in giving that. You can say, no, that's my property and I hold on to it. So I think what could have happened here is, I wouldn't be surprised if they were given correctly at the outset, because that's what you'd expect. 6 spaces is significant. It would be a big mistake for 6 spaces not to be allocated. And perhaps the body corporate decision has just sort of wafted over the technical elements of the matter, that an owner of an exclusive use property has to consent, as well as the bylaw being changed. So you might have your rights to those spaces anyway, and if so, that would be the best result, and you can enforce that obligation. If not, then I think you've got to go back, and I don't know how long this situation has been in place, but you might have a negligence case against a solicitor for not delivering you the protection that you needed. And that's something that you need to investigate. One other thing I would say is check the town plan, the development approval for the particular development. Development approvals continue to operate against future owners. It's not just a matter for the developer. So if there's a development approval that says that car parks have to be allocated in a particular way, and sometimes they do that for commercial property, then that's enforceable, and you can enforce that against the body corporate, which is doing something different to what the original development approval conditions provided. So also it would be interesting to see what approval was given for an education facility. This comes up quite a bit, Margaret. Educational facilities pop up in strata title buildings around Sydney and places like Auburn and Parramatta. English courses for communities that have a high degree of non-English speaking people, and they cause a lot of havoc for these reasons. And many of them, I've found, have not had the appropriate development consent to set up a school in an office block. So that is something worth checking as well. There's a lot in this, Ralph, This is a very complex problem, and if you're not being looked after by a specialist strata lawyer, please give me or Margaret a call, and I'll refer you to somebody who can look after you in this matter, because you've lost a lot of money if this is not fixed, both in the capital value of your property as well as the value of your business.
Absolutely. Well, certainly some good advice there, Ralph. Make sure that you do contact us if need be, and I can put you on to Michael, and Michael can definitely help to get this sorted out for you by giving you the right kind of referrals and the right kind of places to go. Well, that is it for this week's episode of Property Investing. I'm going to come back in 2 weeks' time, and joining me then will be the property professor, Peter Kalizos, and we are going to take a deep dive into the regions and talk about what's happening in the regions and why it's happening and what we can expect to happen in the future. Now, between now and then, keep sending me your questions to pim@mypropertytv.com.au or pop them into any comment on any of my posts. You can also DM them to me. Hundreds of ways you can get your questions to me. If you do send me a question, we always get to it at some point. So keep an eye out on the show for when your question is answered. If we did answer your question tonight, please now send me an email to that same address, pim@mypropertytv.com.au, with the subject book prize. I'm going to need your name and your mailing address so that I can mail the book out to you. It's not an ebook, it's a real, actual published book. Thanks to my guest tonight, Michael. Thanks for being here, Michael.
My pleasure, Margaret. Stay safe.
Yep, we will. We'll stay safe here. I think we're in lockdown for a fair while longer yet.
It's looking that way, at least here in Sydney.
Yeah, so we're going to be doing the show from lockdown for quite some time. Remember, you can find Michael at michaelteys.com.au, and he's also always a great fountain of knowledge for all of your strata needs. Here's all my contact details, the usual ones if you tune in every week. pim@mypropertytv.com.au is our email address. Margaret Lomas's Facebook page, Margaret Lomas Property for Instagram, Margaret Lomas AU for Twitter, and destiny.com.au is also my website, where you can find plenty of information about all the things that we can offer you at Destiny. And one of the things we can offer you is our brand new service for the very busy investor, especially relevant when you're in lockdown, where we take care of everything for you. We find the right investment property for you, one that best matches your personal circumstances wherever it exists in Australia, and it reduces your risk of buying in the wrong area. So why not let us do all the work for you while you get on with all the important things in life? Just go to my website and look for Destiny Property Match to find out more. Have a great week, and I will see you back here in 2 Tuesdays' time.
Property Investing Matters was brought to you by Destiny, empowering investors to achieve success through property investment for more than 24 years.
On the scene like a nightclub king, yeah. Mama got shake for that and so swing, yeah. looky here, lady, gotta know what I mean. Cause I burst a swagger like a pimp when I flip through the room like boom. Tell me what you wanna do. Okay, girl, I did this for you.
You can teach me your game with no reason.